I want to acknowledge Shirley and Bill Boyd for their loving care of this facility and opening it to us for this presentation tonight. I see many friends and people that I know and some I don't know and some I've talked to on the phone, and it's a pleasure to have you all here tonight. I think there's going to be a few more wander in, but they're just going to have to get the cheap seats. Okay, so. We promoted this as Civil War history and why it matters today. That's a pretty provocative statement. It leads to many unanswered questions. In part, the intent of tonight's presentation is to answer some of those questions. This is Michael Gaddy, and in his presentation, he's going to provide truthful and accurate information. There's a lot going on in the world today. We hear it every day on the news and the radio, in our churches, and on Fox News. It says fair and balanced. We want to have fair and balanced information. Okay. Fair and balanced is only fair and balanced when it's fair and balanced. And it can only be fair and balanced when it stands on the foundation of truth and accuracy. If it's not truthful and accurate, it means nothing. Since we're all gathered here in the common interest of the history of this country, if you would join me in just a moment so we address the Father. To our Father, thank you for bringing us all here safely, to this place to hear these words and to find the understanding that will help to reveal the nature of the wickedness we find ourselves living in today. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. And with that, I'll give you Michael Gaddy.
Oh, thanks, guys. Can everybody hear me? I'm usually pretty loud. That's what my wife says. So, the first thing I tell every group I ever speak to, regardless of where it is or what the venue is, don't believe a word I say. Believe absolutely nothing. When politicians start telling me that, we've made some advancements. Believe nothing I say. Research everything I tell you. Find it for yourself. Because then you'll remember it. You'll forget what I tell you. But if you look it up for yourself, and I will give my contact information to anyone who would like to have it. If you find something that you want a source for, you let me know and I'll provide it for you. So I don't ask you to believe anything that I tell you. Years ago, I had a very brilliant man give me some of the best advice I have ever had. And I was studying history. And I had a passion for history. Hated it in high school. In high school, the teachers made it about as exciting as watching paint dry. I had a man who told me, do not read a history book expecting to know the truth. Because anybody who writes a history book will put their slant on history. Whether they're paid to put a slant on history or whether they're by idealism they put a slant on history. He said, if you want to know the truth, go to the source documents of this country. Those source documents can be found in the National Archives. I'm surprised they haven't destroyed them. They can be found in the Library of Congress. Tonight the subject is the Civil War, which is a misnomer because it was not a civil war. Because the South cared nothing for the government of the North, they wanted to get away from it. So it was not a civil war. A fellow by the name of Thomas Jonathan Jackson called it our second war for independence. Later he gained the sobriquet Stonewall. So, almost every malady that you find that we're suffering in this country today, almost every one you can find its source in the Civil War. You can find the problem either in the war or in the 12 years after the war known as Reconstruction, which was basically destruction of the principles of our founders. Someone asked me this past week, said, do you celebrate the 4th of July? And I said, well, isn't that kind of like celebrating your ex-wife's birthday? Because the principles that the people fought for in the Confederacy were the same principles their ancestors had fought Britain for 73 years before. So let's look at some facts. And one of the things I will tell you, if you want to know the truth of the Civil War, you can go to the National Archives. There's 129 volumes. That's called the War of the Rebellion. 129 volumes and one atlas. The truth is in there. And that's not the truth according to the Confederacy. That are the actual documents that were filed during the course of the war. You will be shocked. That's why it's not taught in the schools. Why are our schools teaching socialism? Because after the war, the North sent school teachers and preachers to the South. All of the schools were taught by Northerners, carpetbaggers. All of the preachers were replaced in the Southern churches by Northern carpetbaggers. It's documented. Look it up. So if you're wondering why our children are not going through school, where they're going through school and they're really not learning anything, you can go back to that. But let's go back to a beginning and let's look at Article 7 of the U.S. Constitution. You all have that memorized, right? Words mean something. Listen to these words. Our Constitution is very simple in its wording. Article 7, the ratification of the Convention of 9 states shall be sufficient for the establishment of this Constitution between the states so ratifying the same. Here's a little scenario for you. Like 5 years later, after 1789, after George Washington becomes president. Imagine, if you will, it's 1794. The Senate is meeting. John Taylor of Caroline from South Carolina is speaking to the Senate, and he says, if we don't do something about this debt, our country will be destroyed. What do you think John Taylor of Caroline would say today if he saw our national debt? But he said, I am leaving the U.S. Senate and I am going home to my state of South Carolina, and and I'm going to do something. We are going to get rid of this debt. This country cannot operate with this debt. It is impossible. So as he is leaving, Rufus King, who was a delegate from New York to the Constitutional Convention, but he had become a senator from Connecticut, he stops John Taylor of Caroline and he says, "Could I speak to you for a minute? Let's go in this room here for just a minute." And he says, "I wish to speak to you seriously and candidly upon a very important subject." And he said to John Taylor of Caroline, "It is absolutely impossible, utterly impossible, that we can keep this union together." 5 years after it began. We cannot keep this union together because you Southerners keep messing it up. We keep wanting to borrow money. We keep wanting to be a great empire. You guys keep saying no. And in this next election, if you get if two more Federals lose their position in the U.S. Senate, you Southerners will control the Senate. And then we're doomed. You're not going to let us borrow money. You're not going to let us do what we want to do. So let's split this country up right now because it cannot continue. Let's draw a line. You pick the line. That's what he told John Taylor of Caroline. You pick the line. If we go by the Hudson River, it's okay with us. We'll keep our country up here. If you want to go by the Potomac, it's okay with us as long as we separate. So about that time, Oliver Ellsworth walks into the room. And he said, King, protesting that he had never mentioned the subject to Ellsworth before, ran over the same ideas. And Ellsworth concurred. It was pressed upon Taylor that a friendly intercourse among the members for fixing the outlines of a separation was desirable, and that was separation. So we're told throughout history that the secession is a Southern thing. How many of you have ever heard of the Hartford Convention? North wanted to secede again. They wanted out. They didn't want anything to do with those crazy Southerners. Those crazy people like Thomas Jefferson who wanted responsible government. Crazy people like Patrick Henry who wanted a government that answered to the people. And they said, we can't have that. We need to move along. So what was the debt that John Taylor of Caroline was so upset about? What did this country owe? $91 million. You can make that much playing baseball for 3 years. That's what the debt was. Of course, back then it meant something. A lot more than it does now, but it's not anywhere near $21 trillion. But it was the fact of the debt. I was thinking as I was driving over and I was looking at all of these fishing boats passing. I said, what would this country be like if Americans cared as much about what they were leaving for their children as they did about entertaining themselves? And I was talking with some gentlemen over here. We were talking about the fact that all too many Americans accept the unconstitutional, tyrannical government we have in this country today because somehow it was a fair trade-off for free and an oppressed race of people. Nothing could be more historically incorrect. I will read you a quote from Thomas Jonathan Stonewall Jackson as he made this comment to his chief of staff, Sandy Pendleton. And he said, and I quote, "Mr. Pendleton, if the Republicans lose their little war, they're voted out in the next election and they return to their homes in New York or Massachusetts or Illinois, fat with their war profits. Mr. Pendleton, if we lose our country, we lose our independence, we lose it all." In a conversation with General John Bell Hood, Stonewall Jackson asked him, said, "Do you think you will survive the war, sir?" And John Bell Hood said, "Yes, I think I will, General, but I think I will be horribly wounded," which was very prescient. He lost an arm and a leg. He said, "But I think I will survive." And he said, "General Jackson, what do you think?" And he said, "No, I do not think I will survive. Neither would I want to, should we not prevail." At some point in late 1862, Abraham Lincoln and his Republican administration realized that their unconstitutional, immoral war perpetrated on the people of the South was generating a tremendous loss of life and property, and at some point in history, they would be demanded an explanation for what could only be considered treason. Because at no time, absolutely no time, in 1860 or 1861, did anyone in the North, including all of the northern newspapers, say we're going to war to free the black people. Never mentioned, not once. It was not until they got 2 years into the war that they started saying, hey, we better find some moral high ground. We better find something to hang our hat on because we're going to have one heck of a time explaining this. William Tecumseh Sherman said after the war, had the South won, Ulysses S. Grant, Abraham Lincoln, and I would have been hanged for war crimes. He admitted it. But let's look, how many times have we heard the word treason? Especially recently. There's treason here, there's treason there, there's treason somewhere else. What is the only crime that is defined in the U.S. Constitution? Treason. Article 3, Section 3. And it says, treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them, meaning the states, or adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. Treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them. So levying war against the states is treason. All of these, there's 20 pages of notes here. If you leave me today with your contact information, I will send you all 20 pages of these notes. And you can, there's sources in my notes, or you can send me an email and I'll be happy to answer them. I promise you, if you give me your email address, you will not get any spam. I don't have time to do that. The past 5 months, I have traveled 22,000 miles within the state of Arkansas, speaking to civic groups, tea parties. I've made addresses twice to the Arkansas Trial Lawyers Association. I have addressed the Arkansas Bar Association at their annual meeting. I like to ask lawyers questions about the Constitution. They get real nervous because they know nothing about the Constitution. And I've got them to admit that. The scariest thing in the world is a man who claims to be, or a woman who claims to be, a constitutional attorney and a Christian. Because I've gotten scores of lawyers to admit over the past 5 months that they never study a word of the Constitution in law school.
It's just the supreme law of the land.
They study what some clown in a black gown said the Constitution meant. It's kind of funny, I made a presentation in Faulkner County, Arkansas on the 8th of June, and I called them clowns in black gowns, and there was 2 of them in the audience. And one of them took objection. And I said, I will allow your objection, sir, if you can answer 10 questions about the U.S. Constitution. He chose not to participate. So, we fought a war, according to our history books today, we fought a war to free the black man. But yet, during Abraham Lincoln's inaugural address, March the 4th, 1861, he said this: apprehension seems to exist among the people of the southern states that by the accession of a Republican administration, their property and their peace and personal security are to be endangered. There has never been any reasonable cause for such an apprehension. Indeed, the most ample evidence to the contrary has all the while existed and been open to their inspection. It is found in nearly all the published speeches of him who now addresses you. I do but quote from one of those speeches when I declare that I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the United States where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. Well, he was right. He had no lawful right to interfere with slavery. The Supreme Court had said it was legal. Next time somebody tells you the Supreme Court knows everything and gets it right, tell them. 1857, you said slavery was legal. During the course of its existence, how many times has the U.S. Supreme Court reversed itself? 327 times. I don't trust people who make 327 mistakes on the Constitution. So, which one of those mistakes was constitutional? Which one of their rulings was constitutional? The first one or the second one? And if they declared something to be constitutional, which is something we all need to understand about this healthcare mess, John Roberts said it was constitutional, Obamacare. The Republicans were talking about repeal and replace. Constitutionally, you cannot do that. Yes, sir.
In this Obamacare, the bill was introduced in the United States Senate. It was then challenged by constitutionality. The Supreme Court then ruled that Obamacare was a tax, which made it unconstitutional because all taxes, all revenue bills have to originate in the House. So it's already unconstitutional. Because if they said it was a tax, they made it unconstitutional with that comment.
Except John Roberts said it was not a tax.
The rest of them did, but 5-4.
But they have said both ways, that it was a tax and it was not a tax. In the document itself, it says it's not a tax.
Supreme Court ruled it 5-4.
Well, yeah, 5-4, yeah, I know.
I think that
They
is
also
the
ruled,
question.
they also ruled slavery was legal.
I know that too, 1957, Red Scott.
So, you know, stop and think for a minute, which one of our founders, and he was a good one. We've got good and bad founders, people. So don't group them together. Because we had some shysters that would make Bill Clinton look little among our original founders. We had some terrible shysters. How many of you have ever heard of Benjamin Rush? He said, let our children understand that they do not belong to themselves, they belong to the state. That sound like a socialist? He's the originator of the study of psychology. But let me get back to this point. We'll get back to the healthcare thing, but you cannot repeal it without a constitutional amendment. Because if they said it was constitutional, only one unit can alter the Constitution. And who are they?
People. Conventions.
The President can't do it, the Congress can't do it, the judges can't do it. People have to vote. Look at Article 5. People have to vote. So this whole thing about Obamacare and all of these arguments, it is a joke. And it's all for your consumption. Because they argue about stuff so many times that is completely and totally unconstitutional. But let me get back to Lincoln. He said this. He says, those who nominated and elected me do so with full knowledge that I had made this and many similar declarations, and I have never recanted them. He also said that, of course he lied. Imagine that, a politician lied. But he actually lied and he said, I have heard of a constitutional amendment. Sure he had heard of it. He and Seward put it together. It was called the Corwin Amendment. They got a senator to introduce it. It's called the Corwin Amendment, C-O-R-W-I-N. Corwin Amendment would have made slavery legal in this country in perpetuity and outside of the rule of Congress. Imagine that. So the next time someone tells you that the South seceded to protect slavery, then say, well, if they wanted slavery and that was the only reason they seceded, all they had to do was come back in the Union, because this amendment was already being circulated among the states. It had already been passed by both houses of Congress. So, and how many of you have ever heard of a person by the name of Alexis de Tocqueville? Wrote a book called On Democracy. I'd like to quote something for you from that book, and it says, race prejudice seems stronger in those states that have abolished slavery than in those where it still exists. and nowhere is it more intolerant than in those states where slavery was never known. So the Negro in the North is free, but he cannot share the rights, pleasures, labors, griefs, or even the tomb of him whose equal he has been declared. There is nowhere where he can meet him, neither in life nor in death. In the South, where slavery still exists, less trouble is taken to keep the Negro apart. They sometimes share the labors and the pleasures of the white man. People are prepared to mix with them to some extent. Legislation is more harsh against them, but customs are more tolerant and gentle. Both Indiana in 1816 and Illinois in 1818 abolished slavery by their state constitutions, and both followed the Ohio policy of preventing black immigration into their states. Now, you folks are free, just don't come anywhere where I live. They required any states who moved into the state to produce legal documents verifying that they were free and posting a bond to guarantee good behavior. The bond requirements were $1,000. In 1818, $1,000 was a fortune. Anti-immigration legislation prohibitive for a black American in those days. Anti-immigration legislation passed in Illinois in 1819, 1829, and in 1853. To Indiana, such laws were enacted in 1831 and 1852. Michigan Territory passed the same law in 1827. Iowa passed it in 1839, and Iowa enacted another in 1851 after it became a state, all prohibiting free blacks from living in their state. Oregon Territory passed such a law in 1849. Blacks who violated the law in those states faced punishments that included advertisement and sale at public auction. So in his great rush to find moral high ground, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. I would like to read you from a quote from the National Archives and Records Administration. Source document. Despite the expansive wording, the Emancipation Proclamation was limited in many ways. It applied only to states that had seceded from the Union, leaving slavery untouched in the loyal border states. It also expressly exempted parts of the Confederacy that had already come under Northern control. Most important, the freedom it promised depended upon Union military victory. Although the Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery, it captured the hearts and imagination of millions of Americans and fundamentally transferred the character of the war. It's in the National Archive. The Emancipation Proclamation, a piece of intentionally deceptive legislation, continues to this day to capture the hearts and imagination of millions of Americans. But there's trouble brewing. I don't know if any of you happen to see this notice, but BLM, and that's not the Bureau of Land Management, Black Lives Matter of Illinois has found out that Abraham Lincoln was a racist. And they are demanding his face be taken off of our currency. It took them long enough to discover the truth, but it's beginning to seep in. Now a question. And this was something years ago that really piqued my interest, and I really started studying this. And I've visited, gone to the exact sites, and looked at these places where these events took place. How many of you know what a contraband camp was? As the Northern Army began to move into certain territories, northern Mississippi was a place, coast of North Carolina was another place, parts of Tennessee were places that the Northern Army moved in. Blacks flocked to the Northern Army because they would be free. But what did the Union Army declare them to be? Contraband. So they put them in camps and refused, even when they were starving to death and they couldn't feed them, and they were dying of disease, they refused to let them go back to the plantation no matter how much they begged. Because the president had said we can't let them go back to the plantations because then that will help feed the Confederate Army, so we can't let them go back. So somewhere in that period of time, in those contraband camps, 12.5% of the black population of the South died. How many of you have ever heard of the Devil's Punch Bowl? Natchez, Mississippi. 20,000 in a huge 20,000 died. They were starved to death because the North was not going to give them rations because they needed it for their army. On the coast of North Carolina, they used blacks as slaves to build military fortifications. After several months, the blacks said, but wait a minute, you promised us we would be paid for doing this. We've been doing this for months, we've received nothing. So where's our pay? So the Union Army told them, well, see that ship out there? That ship out there you can see off the coast, all of your money is in that ship. So we're going to row you out there so you can get your money. When they got them on the ship set sail, went to New York. All of those who went out there were impressed into the Union Army. Still weren't paid. I bet you they don't have this in the history books. Reconstruction is another huge mess. And I went to Helena, Arkansas recently to visit the site of the contraband camp there. So someone who is a math genius, tell me, what's 12.5% of 4 million? That would be 10%.
48,000.
Somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000, would that be accurate? So during the war, somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 blacks died at the hands of the Union Army. The documents at Helena, Arkansas at the contraband camp says they were buried with the dead livestock. And sometimes burned to prevent the spread of disease. Now, how many of you know that 3 states put qualifying clauses in their ratification agreement? And those 3 states were?
I think New York, Virginia, and it was in New Jersey or Massachusetts.
Rhode Island.
Okay.
So they put in their ratification agreements. Let me read Virginia's for you. We, the delegates of the people of Virginia, duly elected in pursuance of a recommendation from the General Assembly and now met in convention, having fully and freely investigated and discussed the proceedings of the Federal Convention, and being prepared as well as most mature deliberation, hath enabled us to decide thereon, do in the name and in behalf of the people of Virginia declare and make known that the powers granted under the Constitution, being derived from the people of the United States, may be resumed by them whensoever the same shall be perverted to their injury or oppression, and that every power not granted thereby remains with them and at their will. Now, Rhode Island's was a little bit different. Had a lot of the same, but when Rhode Island said, when they got to it, this part, they said, that may be resumed by them whensoever the same shall be perverted to their happiness. How many of you are happy with the federal government? So Rhode Island said if the federal government ever does anything that makes us unhappy, we can leave. That's not a very tough threshold to get to, is it? Make you unhappy. So, Virginia, when they seceded, referred to that agreement. And they said, we are exercising our authority. So, we all know what Article 4, Section 2 says, right? Don't look at your book. Article 4, Section 2 says that each state is entitled to the privilege and immunities of all of the other states. So if Virginia, New York, and Rhode Island had this right, they all had this right by the Constitution itself. Check me out. Was I right on 4-2?
I think you are. Privilege and immunities.
It's short. You can read it for me.
Citizens of each state shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities of citizens of several states.
Thank you. So if Virginia had the right to withdraw from their compact or contract with the central government, then so did the other 10 states. How many people know that Missouri seceded? One out of how many? As soon as Missouri seceded, what did Abraham Lincoln do? He invaded them.
And Maryland to stop them from voting.
Well, he did, and he put the entire Maryland legislature in prison. And they remained there for the duration of the war, including the mayor of Baltimore. So I don't see why, if that was so great for Lincoln, I don't see why Trump doesn't do it today. I'm kidding, of course. But isn't it funny how both parties love Lincoln? We have a huge monument in Washington, D.C. for the greatest tyrant that ever lived in this country. Why do you think that is? No, he converted the government into exactly what they wanted. A strong central government wherein the states had no say-so. Article 13 of the Articles of Confederation was very specific, and it stated for any law to become law, it had to be ratified by all the states. You ever wonder why they wanted to get away from the Articles of Confederation? We were talking before, how many of you know that the Constitutional Convention of 1787 was a runaway convention. And we're all taught that these wonderful people got together in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, and they were all wonderful Christians, and they got a constitution that was inspired by God. Isn't that what they taught us? I've been told that. I was told that in the same school your dad attended. Now we have this great document, and it was inspired by God. Who did the founding fathers say was the most devout Christian among their group? You can find it in the National Archives. They actually discuss this. Anybody venture any guess? Who was the most devout Christian according to the founders themselves?
Madison.
Say again?
James Madison.
Oh my gosh, no. That was the Bill Clinton of the founding era. He was about 5'4", had a real squeaky voice. That's why he didn't introduce the Virginia plan at the Constitutional Convention, because he was a little short guy and he didn't speak very good, so he gave it to John Randolph to read, who was 6'4" and had a booming baritone voice. You think those people weren't aware of what sold and didn't sell? The most devout Christian. Would you believe that the most devout Christian, according to the founders, and they probably knew, that the most devout Christian among our founders absolutely refused to support the U.S. Constitution? Absolutely refused. When he was asked to attend the Constitutional Convention of 1787, he said, "Oh, I smell a rat," leaning toward a monarchy. And then at the Virginia Ratification Convention, out of 23 days, he spoke against the Constitution 17 days. One time for 5 hours without stopping. Spoke against the Constitution, not for it. Man's name was Patrick Henry. When he made his speech at the Stamp Act, and to oppose the Stamp Act, he started out by saying, Caesar had his Brutus, and Charles II had his Cromwell, and King George III, to which the entire house erupted in treason, treason. And then Patrick Henry said, should learn from the example. And then he said some classic words. If this be treason, let's make the most of it. I know you've all heard the last sentence of his speech at St. John's Church. Patrick Henry was a powerful speaker. But you can't find anything that he wrote. He was an orator. He didn't write stuff. He spoke. And everything was in his heart. But when you read that speech that he ended with, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. Those are the least remarkable words in that presentation. Read the rest of it. I try to make a point to read that once a week, because it is so powerful. I went to St. John's Church doing my due diligence for original documents. Stood in St. John's Church, and there's a space that's marked there where Patrick Henry stood delivering that speech. I watched as groups came in and kids came in. Kids would run over there and stand on it. I didn't feel worthy to stand on that spot. Still don't. But there was that place was packed. They didn't have a fishing tournament that weekend. The place was packed. There were people standing around the windows outside. They didn't have a electronic speaking system. There was a man standing right outside the window. He heard Patrick Henry end that speech in dramatic fashion with "Give me liberty or give me death." And he turned to his wife and he said, "I want to be buried right here. Right where I'm standing, I want to be buried." If you go to St. John's Church, he's buried right outside that window. Those were people who loved liberty. Liberty was the most important thing in their mind. Patrick Henry said, "Don't let anything ever come near that precious jewel." We've got a Bill of Rights. 10 of them, right? How many were introduced to the Congress from the states? Yes, sir.
The first two came from the Iroquois Confederacy.
That is
Freedom of
true.
speech and freedom of
But
thought.
the states copied those and
Yep.
sent them to the Congress. The states sent over 200 requests for their Bill of Rights. One man narrowed them down to 12. James Madison. What was the most listed from all the states? And it made it through to his final cut. What was the most listed? Tenth Amendment. It was the most listed by all the states. All the states did not include a Second Amendment. I know some of us find that hard to believe in the South. Connecticut did not. Did not include a Second Amendment. What is the only amendment that they all issued that was in every one of their packages that came to James Madison? What was the only amendment that was in every one of them? The 7th. The right to trial by jury. Thomas Jefferson said a lot of things. Thomas Jefferson hated judges. He said they are a group of miners and sappers working night and day to destroy the basis of our Constitution. Wow. Imagine that. Someone saw it way back then. Then we have a president named Andrew Jackson, who said to Chief Justice John Marshall, after he had rendered his ruling, President Jackson said, "Well, Mr. Chief Justice, you have issued your opinion. Now let me see you enforce it." Where are men of that character today? Where are men or women that knowledgeable of our Constitution? Our Constitution has problems, and they knew it. They purposely left some holes in that thing so they could slip through. They kept deleting a word that Patrick Henry demanded. What could that word have been?
States.
Real simple word, it's called expressly. They kept putting in, the states kept putting in, we want only the powers expressly delegated to the government. And they kept eliminating it and just putting delegated. And then a few years later, when we had the big blow up between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, we found out why they didn't want expressly put in there. Because Alexander Hamilton said to Thomas Jefferson, there are implied powers in that Constitution. Pardon me for moving. There are implied powers in that Constitution, Mr. Jefferson, you just don't see them. And Jefferson said, where are they? And Hamilton said, read between the lines. To which Jefferson said, I've looked there, and all I see is blank space. What a great discussion. Two brilliant men. Alexander Hamilton was brilliant. But I am a proponent for having a national holiday for Aaron Burr for shooting him.
Yeah.
He just waited too long. Now, where in the world have you seen anybody as powerful today in our lexicon as Alexander Hamilton? We've got a play about it. We've got books about it. George Will said, you Americans like to quote Jefferson, but you live in Hamilton's world. And we do. Who quoted Alexander Hamilton almost word for word in his first inaugural address? Abraham Lincoln. There's a great book. I was telling Darrell this morning, very early on in our marriage, my wife used to tell people, well, when we get paid, we go to the bookstore. And if there's any money left over, we buy some food. And when we move, which we've just done recently, the movers said, how many books do you have? And I've read them all. Some of them twice. I'll make a recommendation for you. There's 2 books out on Alexander Hamilton that I would like for you to read, if you like to read. One of them is by Thomas D. Lorenzo, an economics professor at Loyola University, and it's called The Hamilton Curse. And there's a new one coming out in September, written by Professor Brian McClanahan. And the title of the book is How Hamilton Screwed Up America. I was fortunate enough to read How Hamilton Screwed Up America. And it is great. Professor McClanahan is great. He's one of the few people with letters after his name that has a clue. Which reminded me, I had a lawyer that called me this week and he wanted me to give a presentation in Hope, Bill Clinton's hometown. He wants me to give a presentation to a political active group there that includes lawyers, judges, doctors, what have you. And he said, well, send me a bio. And I sent him one. But which basically said, I've been studying the U.S. Constitution for 30 years and the Bill of Rights. I've been writing on it. I've been speaking on it. And I wonder why Americans let these rascals get by with what they do. And he called me back and he said, well, I kind of wanted something else for your bio. And I said, oh, you're asking for proof of my government indoctrination. And he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, you want to know where I went to school, what I studied. And if I did it in the American education system, it was indoctrination. So you're asking me for my indoctrination credentials. He said, okay, I'll print the first one. So, how many of you people have ever been called a conspiracy nut? Isn't it great? I love it. We ought to form a club. The Conspiracy Nuts of America. What would the acronym be? CSNA. Somewhere like that. Do you folks realize that the Supreme Court at one time addressed conspiracy theories? And they got it right. Listen to what they said. Conspirators do not make minutes of their machinations, progress, and objectives. Seldom, therefore, can conspiracy be proved by other than circumstantial evidence. It is only by assembling the results with such evidence as may be of the progress thereof by the participants that the victim can never make a case of conspiracy. If, in the end, there is a completed structure of results, the frame of which has been furnished piecemeal by several different sources, the parts, when brought together, showing adaptation to each other and fitness for the end accomplished, it is at least reasonable to infer concert in both planning and fabrication. Who are the greatest conspiracy theorists on this planet? Governments. But we believe it. We accept it as gospel somehow. So, there's a couple of things I wanted to ask you. And number one was, one of the things is how many of you, I know some of you who listen to Roger's show heard it because we talked about it. How many of you have ever heard of the Hazard Circular? Wow. Thought you guys were conspiracy theorists. How many of you are familiar with the Bank of England's machinations of our first Constitution? Who do they operate through, sir? Alexander Hamilton and Robert Morris from Pennsylvania. Both of them own banks. Alexander Hamilton loaned money to the federal government. And then he became Secretary of Treasury. Imagine that. We haven't seen that anywhere with Goldman Sachs, have we? When was the Bank of London founded? I know everybody knows that one. So I'll tell you, it was 1694. And it was founded by a gentleman by the name of William Patterson. when he founded the Bank of London, or the Bank of England, whichever one you want to call it, one and the same, he said, classic, original document, not hearsay. He said, the bank hath benefit of interest on all monies which it creates out of nothing. 1694. Now, the Hazard Circular, as its name would imply, was circulated in the U.S. in the late 1850s and early 1860. And I will read the Hazard Circular for you, and if you need documentation of it existing, I can provide that for you. But the Hazard Circular said this: slavery is likely to be abolished by the war, and chattel slavery will be abolished. This I and my European friends are in favor of, for slavery is but the owning of labor, and carries with it the care of labor. While the European plan, led by England, is that capital shall control labor by controlling wages. The great debt that capitalists will see to it is made out of the Civil War must be used to control the value of money. To accomplish this, the government bonds must be used as a basis for banking. We are now waiting for the Secretary of Treasury of the United States to make this recommendation to Congress. It will not do to allow greenbacks, as they are called, to circulate as money for any length of time, as we cannot control that. But we can control the bonds, and through them the bank issues. What was the national debt in 1860? Depending on your source, $93 to $97 million. What was the debt at the end of the war? $6 billion. So, these wonderful Republicans came up with, and please, I criticize Republicans a lot because they need to be criticized. The Democrats, I've forgotten about. They're so far to the left, their cars don't turn right. So when a lot of people, when they hear me criticize Republicans, they go, oh, you must be a Democrat. No. No, I'm an American that loves liberty. So the Republicans came up with these great plans. Just as a question for you folks, how many southern states in 1860 had Abraham Lincoln on their ballot for president? Zero. He wasn't even on the ballot. He won the election with 39% of the popular vote. 39.8, somewhere in there, almost 40%. Not one southern state voted for him. Bet they didn't teach that in your civics class. So we can tell from the Hazard Circular that Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon P. Chase, Chase Manhattan Bank, that's where it got its name, was being manipulated or controlled by the banking cabal. While there are those on the left and the right who deny the existence of the Hazard Circular, it is in fact there. I can provide the evidence for that. I found it myself. So suddenly, Secretary of the Treasury comes up because Lincoln in about late 1861 or 1862 started asking his cabinet, how are we going to finance this war? We don't have the money. So he issued greenbacks. Unconstitutional. I'm not going to ask you how much, but how many of you have paper money in your pockets? It's all unconstitutional.
Article 1, Section 8. Congress would coin money.
Must coin money. Paper money is unconstitutional. In our Constitutional Convention of 1787, they absolutely did not agree with paper money. Of course, they don't tell us that today. That's why they stipulated in the Constitution that it must be coined, because if it is coined, it has some intrinsic value. Paper money is worth exactly what that piece of paper is worth. And we've proved that since 1913, because the dollar in 1913 compared to the dollar today, it's worth 3 cents. That's probably about what it costs to print it. So it's absolutely worthless. So Chase got, and there is evidence of this, that the Bank of London, the Bank of England, sent Salmon P. Chase $500,000 to spread throughout the Congress to support the Currency Act of 1862. Now, the Currency Act of 1862 made the greenbacks, you could still have them, but you couldn't pay a debt with them. So what good is money if you can't pay a debt? So those greenbacks are all right if you got them, just can't use them. So with the banking acts or currency acts of 62, 63, and 64, Salmon P. Chase said government bonds must be used as a banking basis. Secretary Chase, realizing the necessity of collecting taxes in order to continue the war of aggression on the people and the property of the South, also with the blessings of Abraham Lincoln, created the Bureau of Internal Revenue, that we call the IRS, and also instituted the very first income tax in this country. Now, the Supreme Court don't always mess it up, because 5 times before 1913, the Supreme Court said a tax on an individual was unconstitutional.
Yeah, in the Constitution it says no direct taxation can be levied on a citizen of the United States unless it's equal in portion. In other words, the debt that's owed has to be divided among all.
But Patrick Henry didn't want that. Patrick Henry opposed that.
Yeah.
He said anytime a government can tax an individual, you are no longer free.
Right. That's right.
You are a slave. That's right. He said the way that it's supposed to work is the way that it worked under the Articles of Confederation. The federal government says we need this much money. They send a bill to the states based on apportionment, population. And they sent it to the states, and then it was up to the states to collect. Who was the first president to violate the Constitution? Don't whisper it.
George Washington.
And which part of the Constitution did he violate?
It's the taxation clause. Whiskey tax.
Whiskey bearing tax.
Article 4, Section 4. Now, Article 4, Section 4 is a pretty inclusive clause. It says that the federal government must guarantee to every state a Republican form of government. That doesn't mean a government run by Republicans.
No.
A Republican form of government is a representative form of government. We don't have that. So they're violating that part. It also says that the federal government must protect every state from invasion.
Right.
We're blowing that one big time.
They invaded.
And then the last part, which Washington violated, says that the federal government cannot go into any state to put down incursion or rebellion unless requested to do so by the legislature of that state. So George Washington and Alexander Hamilton took a larger army into Pennsylvania to collect the whiskey tax than Washington had at any time during the Revolution. So what was important to them?
Money.
That's why they needed to get away from the Articles of Confederation. I don't know how you people feel about it, but that's what really scares me today about this Article 5 Constitution Convention that they want to have. Because I will promise you this, not one of us will ask to be a delegate. The people who will be picked to be delegates are the ones who are already violating our Constitution as it is. So lo and behold, the war is over, and, well, I forgot to tell you guys in the back, there's going to be a test. Just kidding. So the radical Republicans take over Congress, take over everything. Who assassinated Abraham Lincoln? Who was responsible for his assassination?
I believe the Congress was.
Booth shot him.
Say again, sir?
I said Booth shot him, but I think it was the combination of the Bank of England and the England's Republican Party.
Well, you know what? History just keeps repeating itself. Who had Abraham Lincoln asked to come in and protect our ports because he thought that England and France were going to support the South?
Russia.
Nicholas II from Russia. Russia was protecting the ports of New York, Boston, and San Francisco.
They didn't have much of a navy, though.
Well, it was enough to get the job done.
Well, I think too, the proximity of Russia to England and France kind of.
So, there is a question here, and I asked this on Roger's show. I brought this up. I think it was new to a lot of people. We've all heard about all of the Confederate monuments being destroyed in New Orleans, right?
Yeah.
What is the only one that's still standing? The one which no one has even desecrated.
Jude P. Benjamin.
Benjamin.
Judah P. Benjamin owned 186 slaves in 1860, owned a plantation, and had 3 offices in the Confederate government. Secretary of War to start with, then Secretary of State, and then Secretary of the Treasury.
Now, didn't he carry off some gold? I thought he suspected carrying some.
Don't tell everybody. That's a secret. Stonewall Jackson hated Judah P. Benjamin. hated him with a passion because he said that Judah P. Benjamin, as Secretary of War, kept the Confederacy from winning the war. Because right after the first major battle, which is called, you called it Bull Run, I called it Yankee Run. Because the Confederate forces whipped the Yankees so bad, they threw down their arms and ran back to Washington, D.C.
Along with Congress.
Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, his mother must have really not liked him. P.G.T. Beauregard and Stonewall Jackson wanted to pursue them into Washington and end the war.
Yeah.
Secretary of War said no, and talked Jefferson Davis into saying no. Great mistake. Who was the Secretary of War? Judah P. Benjamin. Stonewall Jackson referred to Judah P. Benjamin as President Davis's pet Jew.
Right. Yeah.
I know I'm stepping on tender ground here with a lot of people, and I understand that. I was brought up a Southern Baptist too. But the truth's the truth.
Amen.
The truth wears no political party. It is a non-respecter of any race of people. And nothing is probably more disliked in this country than truth. Because you just can't get around it. But again, almost every malady that we see in this country today came from the war. And we have the unratified 14th Amendment. How many knew that? Never ratified. 16th, never ratified. 17th, never ratified. Those three amendments are destroying this country. And they were never ratified. The 14th Amendment, Article 4 of the 14th Amendment will really kick you in the backside because it says the validity of the national debt shall never be questioned. So every time, well, we just violated the Constitution today because we talked about the national debt. And we questioned it. There's another great book I'll recommend to you. It's called The Crimes of the Civil War and the Curse of the Funding System. Source document, written 1867, published 1868.
Should give that title again.
Crimes of the Civil War and the Curse of the Funding System. Written by a judge and a preacher, Henry Clay Dean, from Iowa. Lincoln had put him in prison because he was talking against Lincoln's unconstitutional acts. How many people did Abraham Lincoln put in prison? With no trial, no charge. He just had them put in prison. How many? Rough guess?
20,000,
Double it.
7.
40,000 people. Or
What did he-
more.
What did he do with the newspapers?
I'll get to it. You can find the documentation for that in a book called The American Bastille, written in 1907, I think, from original documents. 40,000 people put into prison for doing absolutely nothing but questioning the President of the United States. He shut down over 300 newspapers in the North that didn't agree with it. He took a member of Congress who protested his unconstitutional acts on the floor of the U.S. Congress and had him deported to Canada. The Landing Hand was his name, congressman from Ohio. How many of you have ever heard of the Ku Klux Klan? How many of you have ever heard of the Union League? How many of you have ever read the Minority Report of the investigation of the Ku Klux Klan, 1868? Read it. There were 21 senators picked to be on that committee. 13 of them voted for a condemnation of the Klan. 8 Northern senators did not, and they wrote a minority report. And they said this committee has been fed undocumented evidence by witnesses that we can't confirm, we can't prove anything about them. They've been brought in, they're giving us stories that we can't provide evidence for. It's a great report. Read it, you'll like it. They're much more eloquent than I am. So, today, we have a government that has said that it's okay to kill unborn children. There are those of us who believe that to be immoral. But it's legal. What if we perpetrated a war on those who believed that it is good law because it is legal?
Can I say something about that? You know, the Jews in Judah went to the Babylonian captivity for 70 years. Idol worship. The idol they worshiped was called Molech. Particular idol required child sacrifice. They had fires and they would throw kids and babies in there alive, burn them up. And they got 70 years for that. What do you think is going to happen for this abortion business and selling baby parts, etc.?
Well, we have succeeded in, we've made Adolf Hitler look like a piker when it comes to taking innocent life. And we have Stalin, who made Hitler look like a piker from the beginning. And Mao Zedong. Well, let's go back to the 20th century. Governments killed over 200 million of their own people in the 20th century. Doesn't count war. So they killed 200 million. You had a comment, sir?
Yes, sir. The Vietnam Memorial up in Washington, D.C., that black granite wall with 58,000 names on it, hold the names of the babies that has been slaughtered in this country, would have to kill 1,000 times that big.
Yes.
The graveyard, if you started it, went 3,000 feet across with each patch Montgomery. This area.
True.
Give you a little bit of sense of what's going on.
Well, I'm going to tell you folks a couple of other things, and some of you aren't going to like me for this, and that's okay. Because I judge my effectiveness by the number of people who don't like me. I do not pledge allegiance to this.
Amen.
I refuse to pledge allegiance to that. I will not. That makes a lot of people angry. I've got a preacher that absolutely hates me because of that. He told me so.
How many years were you in the military, Michael?
I don't even talk about that anymore. Sorry. But I explained this to someone recently who asked me that question. He said, "Why don't you put that on your bio?" And I said, "Because I find it hard to embrace something as an attribute that I had to ask God forgiveness for." Every war that we've fought since 1941 was unconstitutional. I know that offends some people, and that's okay, because I was tricked too.
My husband too.
I was tricked. And then I learned about Reconstruction, and I learned why we Southerners are so darn patriotic. Because it was drilled into us over and over and over and over again. Trust the government. When those preachers came down during Reconstruction, they made the young people stand up and pledge allegiance to Abraham Lincoln and the federal government. The churches, the schools, they all did. That's why we Southerners are so patriotic. Is that a flag of racism?
No.
What is the official name of that flag?
Battle flag.
Battle flag.
St. Paul's or St. Andrews.
St. Andrew's Cross.
St. Andrew's Cross. Who was St. Andrew?
He was the quiet one in the boat beside Simon, who later became Peter.
Simon Peter's older brother. St. Andrew was crucified in Greece for preaching the Word of God. And when they told him they were going to put him on a cross, he said, "No, I am not worthy for your cross. Turn it this way." You know, in some ways, I am so glad that the people of this country are ignorant as that chick. What's the Alabama state flag? St. Andrew's Cross. What is the national flag of Jamaica? Pardon me?
Is that right?
St. Andrew's Cross. Jamaica's 94% black.
Yeah.
They just have different colors. Black, green, and gold. Why did they adopt that flag? Resistance to tyranny. The Jamaicans adopted that flag. You won't see the pictures, but how many of you remember those students standing up to those tanks in Tiananmen Square in '89? What flag were they holding? That one. When the Chechens rebelled against the Russians, what flag did they carry? That one. How many of you have ever been to Monticello? On the cemetery gate. Did you look at the cemetery?
I was about 15 years old.
Do you remember, sir? Did you look at the cemetery?
I was 19, I can't remember what I had for breakfast.
When I was 19, the only thing I remembered was girls. So,
But I did go.
At Monticello's graveyard, there is a huge iron work right in the center, a huge medallion. Thomas Jefferson had put on that medallion what Benjamin Franklin wanted to be the motto of the United States. Resistance to tyranny is obedience to God. I had a preacher tell me, he said, I can't find that in the Bible.
Is that still standing?
Pardon me?
Is it still standing?
Yes.
At Monticello, I would have thought that's a government property, it'd be gone by then.
Well, thank goodness for the dumb ones who can't figure it out. For the people that can't look at the Alabama flag and realize that that is a St. Andrew's cross. The flag of Florida, St. Andrew's cross. Scotland especially. The Scots. How many of you ever read a book called Born Fighting? If you're wearing that shirt that says Scotland, you better read that book. Born Fighting by former Senator James Webb. My wife read that book and sat one day and she said, "Oh my God." And I said, "What's the matter?" She said, "Now I understand you. I understand why you're so darn stubborn." I understand why you love to fight these battles. I understand it now. There's another book you should read too, and it's called From Ulster to the Carolinas, which talks about our Scots-Irish heritage. How many people know that 25% of Abraham Lincoln's army were not citizens of the United States? He had at least 8 generals that were not citizens of the United States. Where did they come from?
Ireland.
Europe. Some of them from Ireland. But why had they come to the United States? Because they had started to foment a socialist revolution in Europe and were kicked out.
1848.
1848. They moved to America, and what did they buy primarily? Newspapers. During the Civil War, who wrote more editorials for the Chicago Tribune than any other writer? Some crazy guy by the name of Karl Marx.
Yeah.
What?
Karl Marx.
Karl Marx's close personal friend for years was a guy by the name of Charles A. Dana. Charles A. Dana was Lincoln's Assistant Secretary of War. Close personal friend of Karl Marx. On page 539 of his magnum opus called Mein Kampf, Adolf Hitler praised Abraham Lincoln for dissolving the states and putting everything under one control, because that's exactly what Hitler did in Germany. He abolished the state governments. Well, I'm going to tell you folks, this outline that I have here is designed for a 4-hour class. Most of my classes are 4 hours, and I'm sure no one wants to stay here till midnight. So we have like 10 minutes left. I would like to entertain any questions. I didn't finish what I had prepared, but I very seldom ever do. But like I said, I will send all of these notes to anyone. I have a series, free There's no charge. I don't charge anybody for this. I've been asked about that, said, why don't you charge fees? Why don't you sell stuff? And I said, because I've researched my founders, and I haven't found one of them that made money promoting liberty. So I don't require any payment for anything. As a matter of fact, if they don't shoot me as soon as they read some of my stuff, I have prepared a constitutional course for this young lady and several of her friends in Georgia. All of what I have learned, and I love what Darrell did when he just put my name down, historian. Because when I was in Washington, D.C., I used to go into the National Archives on every day that I had available. And I would research source documents for hours, making notes. Those notes I still have. I made copies of what I could make copies of. Some of it's turned in pretty handy here lately that I was able to find some letters from Solomon Rothschild, sent back to his family in France in 1859, right before the war. Very relevant, as a matter of fact. So everything that I have comes from source documents, and I'll be happy at any time. Again, I'm being redundant, but I want you to know, if you have any questions about anything I've said, you want any documentation, I'll tell you where you can find it. But I spent hours in the Library of Congress. I've spent hours at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill researching their original documents at the University of South Carolina in Columbia. So the old man, the old professor who told me many years ago, don't trust a history book, trust source documents. Yes, sir.
Do you have a letter from the governor, the de jure governor of North Carolina, when an appointee of Grant was put in his place? A martial law government took over North Carolina.
Right.
And he said, well, it'd be useless to try to oppose the issue after we just got whooped.
Well, in 1876, Mississippi elected a governor and a Congress. Ulysses Grant sent the army in and took them out and put in his son-in-law as governor. So, again, if you want to understand why this country's in the mess it's in, you can relate it back to the Civil War. Or as a very old aunt that I had used to say, don't say Civil War, son. It was the wall of northern aggression. And how right she was. Yes, sir.
Two things, would you tell us a little bit about those letters from Solomon Rothschild? And before you do that, something that I've wondered about, and I wonder if you've ever come across information about it. There was something like, my memory is vague about the numbers, something like 600 girls were rounded up in Roswell, Georgia.
Atlanta area.
Yeah, and kept on the town square for quite some time.
During the siege of Atlanta.
And then they disappeared, not to be heard of again. Do you have any idea?
There's documents in Atlanta that support that.
I
There's
know
also,
where one is buried, and the story is on the tombstone.
and there were, you're right, and there
Up
were,
here at Mount Vernon, up above Sand Rock, Mount Vernon Cemetery, she's got a Confederate battle flag and the first national battle flag on her flag. Her name was Elizabeth Stewart.
well, here's something, and I was telling Darrell about it this morning. Our son graduated from Virginia Military Institute. which I refer to as the very military institute, used to be. It's now gone like the rest of them. They actually give their cadets coloring books now for stress. But when my son was there, when he graduated in 2001, he's a mischievous guy. He gets it from his mother. He went to the sergeant major of the Corps at VMI, and he said, Sergeant Major, he said, our son was in the pipe and drum corps. He plays the bagpipes. And Scottish. And he said, Sergeant Major, we're going down to honor a Confederate veteran. And we're going to go down with our pipe and drum corps, parts of it, and some reenactors who are also cadets. And we're going down to honor this Confederate soldier. And we would like a permit to do so. And he said, well, I'm not sure, that's proper, all of this political correctness. And the Sergeant Major was black. And my son said, you would deny us the right to honor a person of our heritage? And he said, well, okay, all right. And our son said, and I was there, because my son had told me what they planned to do. He said, well, Sergeant Major, you want to go with us? And he said, no, I couldn't do that. My son said, too bad, sir, because he's black. There's a cemetery in Lexington, Virginia, 2 blocks down from Stonewall Jackson's home. It's called the Green Cemetery. I don't know where they got the name. I haven't found that. But there are 2 tombstones in that cemetery, which is an all-black cemetery. There are 2 tombstones in that cemetery with the Confederate flag on them. One of them was a man by the name of Levi Miller, who received a Confederate pension and was decorated for bravery at the Battle of Gettysburg. How many of you have ever heard of the Sanitary Commission, which was the hospital corps? The commander of the hospital corps in Winchester, Virginia. How many of you have ever been to Winchester? Winchester changed hands over 50 times during the war. Very pivotal point. So one time of this march coming in, I'll keep moving. So at one point, Stonewall Jackson's army takes Winchester, Virginia, and they overtake it before the Sanitary Commission can leave. So Stonewall goes in personally to the hospital, and he tells the Union leader of the hospital corps, he said, there will be no one will bother you. You will be allowed to tend to your wounded. You will be allowed to leave peacefully with your wounded whenever you feel like you're ready to leave. So this head of the sanitation, or the sanitary commission, hospital corps, he writes a letter to Washington, to the Secretary of War, Stanton. And he explains what had happened. And in that official report, in Washington, D.C., in those manuals of the War of the Rebellion, the leader of the Sanitary Commission said, in Stonewall Jackson's army were at least 3,000 blacks who wore the same uniforms and had the same equipment as their white counterparts. And I mentioned that to a professor one time, and he said, well, that's easy to explain. they were slaves and they were forced to carry the rifles of the men they were there with. And I said, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to get a slave and hand him a gun. So the documents are there, especially the atrocities that were committed against the Southern civilian. Yes, sir.
Michael, have you ever researched or considered that the Constitution of the United States of America is the federal Constitution and a separate and distinct document than the Constitution for the
yes,
little U, United States of America, and that explains why the 14th and all subsequent amendments were really never properly ratified, because they are not the same document and don't have the same requirements as the original.
Well, we had the discussion over here before this whole thing started, and that was the fact that the preamble to the Constitution says, we, the people of the United States, do ordain and establish blah, 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 for the people of the United States of America.
Yes.
Now, when people look at that preamble, they don't see any difference. We, the people of the United States, do for the people of the United States of America. Words mean something.
Exactly.
Also, go to 28 USC 3002 15A, and it will tell you that the United States is a corporation.
Yes. And that Constitution of the United States of America is just corporate bylaws for the federal United States, and it's not the national union of.
I have a complete class on that. But
So you agree?
yes, but you've got to get people to a level, you know, I've always said, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time.
Yes, yes.
And the thing I've learned in doing this for 30 years is if you feed people too much of the elephant, they get choked
It's called cognitive dissonance.
and they don't want to hear anymore because you have made them uncomfortable.
What was the section in that Title 28?
Yes, sir.
Well, it's not a question, maybe it is, but, all right, we take this group right here, pretty much we're just average people. At least I consider myself average, even though in my heart, since I was a kid, I felt like we were getting screwed. 5 years ago, my brother, all kinds of degrees, great guy, state director, was imprisoned by our federal government on fraudulent charges. So then I began to really realize what I had believed for a long time was true, because I was living it. You know, it's one thing when you're on the outside, yeah, and you don't do anything. Then when it's in your family and it hits home and you know it's real, but the question, I guess, is what, as us as individuals, other than telling people, what can you do? I mean, you know, here you're an educated man, you've done a lot of things. I appreciate that you would come out here to a community like ours, share your time, your expertise, and yet, you know, it's almost like we're not even deserving for you to be here, because I asked several people to come, and of course, everybody's too busy, and they don't care, you know, they're wrapped up in their own little worlds. So I'm saying, if you're saying this to me, and these individuals, other than being aware and letting people say you're a conspiracy nut, or say, well, I know, but I know you're right, but I ain't got time, you know, the think about it, do anything about it, what can I do other than show up to a meeting like this, tell people what I believe? I read books, give people books. They won't read the books. They won't even listen, even though they know that I'm right. So what do we do? You're on a mission. You are doing what I consider is a great quest for liberty. But are we going to have to be enslaved before the country as a whole realizes we're screwed? They don't know it.
You're going to have to take their comfort away.
When is it going to change?
Well, let me tell you what drives me. Two things. I'll go what is personal first, and then I'll go with what the big picture is second. First of all, with me, I had an attorney, very prominent attorney in the state of Arkansas at the Bar Association, ask me the question you just asked. He said, "Why do you do this?" And I said, "I have a great fear." And he said, "I can't imagine you standing up to all these lawyers telling us we're a worthless bunch of crap." He said, "I can't imagine you being scared of much of anything." And I said, "I didn't say you're worthless bunches of crap, sir. That's something in the name you gave yourself." But I said, my greatest fear is to be lying there in my 6-foot box with a tombstone and have my grandchildren come walking up and say, "Grandpa, why didn't you do something?" That motivates me every day. Because every day when I get up, I take that phone and I look at my grandchildren. And I know that what I'm going to do that day, I do for them. Now, there's times when I really get discouraged. When that time comes, I go to the book of Isaiah. And I look at what Isaiah was told. And I'm going to paraphrase this story for you. I can't quote the scripture. But King Uzziah was in control. Did I pronounce that right? King Uzziah was in control, and he had a very despotic government, very despotic leadership. And God said to Isaiah, "Isaiah, I want you to go out there and I want you to spread the word. I want you to start telling these people what this man is doing. I want you to go out there, I want you to tell them." And Isaiah says, "Okay, Lord, I'll do it." And then God says, "But Isaiah, they're not going to listen." And Isaiah says, "Well, God, that doesn't make any sense. Why am I going to go out there to do this if they're not going to listen?" And he said, "Because I have a remnant that needs to hear your words. They need to be bolstered by your words. They need to know they're not in this by themselves." And he said, "Isaiah, you won't know who they are. And it's not important that you know who they are." And he said, "You're also planting seeds. You're putting seeds in the minds of men, and something will happen later on in their life, and they will go back to that seed." And so Isaiah says, "Well, Lord, how will I know if I'm doing it right?" And he says, "Well, if a lot of people show up and you start making a lot of money, you're doing it wrong." Now that's paraphrased. But he speaks of the masses opposed to the remnant. The masses are not going to listen. They're bass fishing. The masses are not going to listen. They're showing up at football games and getting drunk and making asses of themselves in front of their children. They don't care because they don't want to be free. They want to be comfortable. And as soon as that comfort begins to diminish, then they'll be asking you, "Why didn't you tell them something before?" I promise you, it's already happening. I've already seen it happen. So that's my answer to that question. I hope I answered it for you. There is a book, not a book, but a pamphlet that you can find on the internet that was written by Albert J. Nock. And the title of it is Isaiah and the Remnant. And that is a great thing to read. For me, it inspires me. Because and when that happens, if 4 of you showed up tonight instead of the ones that did, I'd still be happy. Because I would know that in that 4 was some of the remnant. The masses aren't concerned with freedom. They like what they have. They like the fact that the government can force their children to be vaccinated. They like the fact that, you know, that the federal government tells the states you have no power. They like that. They're fine. Just don't make them uncomfortable. Joseph Stalin made the statement that as long as and Mao Zedong made this statement, as long as my people have 3 bowls of rice a day, I can do anything I want to. So he killed 50 million of them. Now I'm pretty sure when he got down to killing them, they weren't comfortable with that part. But they were comfortable right up to that part. Same thing's going to happen to us. We can't continue on this path, people. You know, it's simple logic. It can't happen. It's not going to happen.
Will you answer my question?
Well, thank you, sir. I hope I did.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you, it's my understanding that the American Revolution was only about 4% of the people. You know, 96%.
Well, there were about 3% who were leaders.
Okay.
Now, some others, when they began to see, and I made this statement to Darrell today when we were talking, and he said, I moved from up north and I came down here and I found out that you people aren't really rebels. And I said, well, you're right, because it was indoctrinated out of us during Reconstruction. But who were the original rebels? No, not really.
The apostles?
No, in America.
Oh.
Who were the original rebels? April 19th, 1775, Lexington Green. Farmers and shopkeepers standing up there, standing with their rifles. Major John Pitcairn of the Royal Marines, British Royal Marines. He comes up with all of his forces. Here they stand with this pitiful little group. And what does he say? Disperse, you rebels. So you Yankees were the first rebels.
We got something right.
He said, disperse, you rebels. Rebels do not and will not ever say, I comply to tyranny. It's not in our makeup. It's not in our DNA. We will not do it. And I tell people this over and over and over again. How many people control this country? Of the ones we know. I'm not talking about the bankers, because they control our politicians and our courts. There's 535 of them.
Right.
535 people control 320 million people. In what world does that make sense?
DC.
So what I'm saying is, us 320 million got to get up and do something. And I'm not provoking violence. I don't agree with violence. I don't think it's an answer to anything. Because when you have a war, I promise you, nobody wins. Nobody ever wins a war. There is no such thing as a winner in war. Some people might prevail, but nobody wins. So there's 535 people bossing us around. What did our founding fathers fear? The 2 things that they feared more than anything in the world. And And they spoke about these two objects over and over and over again. And what were those two objects?
Big government?
No.
Judiciary.
A standing army,
And a central bank.
and, as Patrick Henry said, federal and state sheriffs. In those days, we didn't have a word for Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. We didn't have a word for the FBI. We didn't have a word for the DEA. We didn't have a word for all this. But Patrick Henry saw it coming, and he called it federal sheriffs. And he told John Marshall, the federal sheriffs will eat out your sustenance, and you will be powerless to do anything. And John Marshall said, who could imagine such a thing as you just said, Mr. Henry? Who would believe that the federal people will come into your homes and take what you own? Who would believe that? Virginia Ratification Convention, June the 7th, 1788. You can read it for yourself. But Nancy Reagan said, just say no to drugs. Why can't we just say no to unconstitutional laws? Just say, no, I will not comply. You don't have to go run and get your musket and say, I'm going to threaten everybody to come. No, I'm not going to do that. And if we could get enough people to say that, how many people will buy into the fact of the phrase that is used, we are a nation of laws? How many people accept that? Thomas Jefferson was asked to define rightful liberty. Not just liberty, rightful liberty. And he said, and I'll paraphrase the first part because I haven't memorized it, but I have memorized the second part. He said, rightful liberty is your ability to do whatever you want to do that is restricted only by my right to do the same thing. So as long as I don't infringe on your rights, I can do whatever I want to. My grandfather had a phrase for that. He said, boy, your rights end at my nose. I didn't realize he was a student of Jefferson. But that's what he said rightful liberty is. And then he said, I do not mention the law, because the law is often nothing but the tyrant's will, and always so when it violates the rights of an individual. Take your vaccination laws, that's Jefferson's quote. It's the tyrant's will. And again, he hated judges. He said that the belief that the Supreme Court, in its power, has the right to decide what is and what is not constitutional is totally out of line. I'm paraphrasing again. He said it's totally wrong, and if it were so, it would create a, what do you call it? A oligarchy. Thank you. He said it would be an oligarchy. This country was not meant to be ruled by 9 people with black robes. It was not meant for that. Nowhere can you find that in our Constitution, that they have the right to rule. They believe it. But look at, and I'm running over time, I'm sorry. But look at Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She was confirmed by the Senate 96-3 with a wonderful Republican by the name of Bob Dole saying it was the greatest selection that had ever been made for the Supreme Court. And as an appellate court judge, Ruth Bader Ginsburg had written an opinion that it should not be against the law for adults to have sex with children.
You know, that's right out of town.
And you telling me these senators didn't know that? If they didn't know that, they're derelict in their duties.
He was trying to help them out.
If they did know it, and as an attorney, who was her number one client?
Probably Bill.
No, on permanent retainer. They gave her, I think it was $100,000 a year every year, just in case something came up. You ever heard of NAMBLA?
Oh,
Yeah. Wow.
And she sits on the Supreme Court. She wouldn't know the Constitution if she found it in her Cheerios.
She may not have found the Cheerios in the little house.
I can hope. I can hope. Natural selection does take its toll.
Sooner or later.
Yes, sir.
Mike, let me go back and ask you, if there's anything that you can tell us about those letters. Were they letters from Solomon?
I'm having those letters printed. If you would like my card, my email address is on there. You can send me or drop me an email, I'll give them to you.
And may I make a comment?
Yes, sir, please
The
do.
rest of this, the reason we see so few people out here, gosh, I remember a cartoon from back in the early 60s.
Hogo?
Showed, no, not that one. It showed a couple of guys with big sombreros on. They had rifles and they were lying down behind some barricades in the street. And one of them says to the other, "Why do so few people show up for these elections?" And but the character trait that is most lacking in human beings is courage. And if you look for collections of quotes, you find very few quotes about courage. And you're not going to get an awful lot of people because courage is such a rare trait. That's
Who in American history displayed their courage real well? One of my heroes. Have you ever looked at the signatories to the Constitution?
right.
Who signed in real big?
John.
John Hancock. Why did he do that? Because King George said, "I will hang anybody that signs that document." And John Hancock said, "I wanted to make sure he didn't have to use his glasses to see mine."
Yeah.
That's courage.
Yeah.
That's why he wasn't invited to the Constitutional Convention. So that is true courage. And we've run over, folks. I apologize for keeping you past your time. I appreciate you coming out. If you like one of my cards, I'll have one of my cards up here. And if you will notice on the back of my card, there is something very dim. And you really have to look at it close to read it. Right there?
Right, that's correct.
And it's a Thomas Jefferson quote. And there's a word in that quote that's really, really important. And it's a simple word called against. And it says a Bill of Rights is what the people are entitled to against their government. Bill of Rights are extremely important. All 50 states, if you look at their Constitution, what comes first in the Constitution? A Declaration of Rights. In the U.S. Constitution, the Federalists didn't even want one. They didn't want a Bill of Rights. You don't need that? No, that's all right. Let's go on without it. You don't need it. Bill of Rights is all we have. And as Jefferson said, where does our rights originate? With your Creator. Why does government want you to denounce a Creator? Because then who do you look to for your rights? Government. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, you got it.